I'm Edith Ruina. I've been around MIT for many years. When my husband came in 1963, we arrived here and have gotten to know people in the community and the MIT community itself very well over the years. So it was a great honor for me to be asked to interview presidents' wives for their experiences. And I have talked with 3 presidents' wives whose experiences cover the period from 1957 to 1990. They cover the administrations of J. Stratton, Paul Gray, and Betty Johnson, I should really mention before Paul Gray because she came first in the sequence, and Priscilla and Paul Gray. Unfortunately, Leah Wiesner, who was also a very active wife when her husband Jerry was president, was not able to participate. J. Stratton died this year at the age of 93, and Jerry Wiesner died just before our interviews at the age of 79. So, and Leah is in ill health and not really able to participate in this series. The Women's League was eager to capture something of the experiences of these women in connection with the 80th anniversary of the Women's League. The Women's League itself has gone through many transitions over this period of time, and the wife of the president is always an honorary chairperson of the league, so they have particularly interesting things to say. I personally was particularly interested because I think the role of women in the period that these women were occupying the wife role is exceedingly interesting, as well as the whole history of the period, which included so many major pieces of American history that MIT became related to, whether it was the McCarthy era, the Vietnam War, all kinds of issues of the military role in science, and each of the wives has had experience in dealing in one way or another with some of these issues that their husbands were concerned about. I found the talks with the wives exceedingly interesting, and each one does I think, a marvelous job of conveying how they handled the responsibility, all in admirable ways. The League was happy to do this as part of its own historical exploration of the League and the Institute, and wants this to become part of the MIT archives and its historical record, because we believe that the wives of the presidents can enhance the perspective of the whole history of the MIT community. So it's with great pleasure that I hope you will listen to these remarks by Kay Stratton, Betty Johnson, and Priscilla Gray. It was certainly wonderful for me to talk with them and get to know them even better. Anything, as much as I can remember. Right? Because I'm a little nervous too. You don't have a monopoly. Yeah, okay. Okay, Kay, first of all, I want to say how happy I am to see you and have the chance to talk with you. And as you know, this is part of the Women's League program to record some of the history of MIT through the eyes of presidents' wives. And one of the things I did, and I expect you did too, was review your written remarks to the annual meeting. And I noticed that you started out talking about entering the new house in your new life as the in the role of president's wife with a little trepidation, and you described it as redefining your life. Could you tell us a little about that?
Well, I had a tiny bit of practice in redefining my life because when Jay was made acting president, we were asked to come in from Belmont with our 3 daughters, 2 of whom were teenagers. We had 2 years in the penthouse at 100 Memorial. And that was kind of, it was a good time to try to understand what the presidency was all about and what expectations they had of me. And so it was very happy. And then in 1959, we moved down to the president's house. And that was really scary. It was, as you know, a huge house, and nothing had been done to it in heaven knows how many years. And the corporation, in their most enormous generosity, let us redo the whole house. And I had the joy of working with Betsy Beckwith, who is an architect and designer, and that was really a learning situation. So that was my beginning in the president's house.
I'm sorry, I just want to move. Okay, thanks.
Now you said that you got some idea what was expected of you. What was expected of you?
Well, as I look at the role, I had been very active in what was then known as the Matrons and is now the Women's League. And there was a great deal of reorganization of that organization. And so I was deeply involved in that. But I felt that the role that I had to play was as a learner and as an advocate. And I worked with the women's students, and I did a tremendous amount of hostessing because it seemed to me that if you wanted to learn about the faculty and you wanted the faculty to know each other, then entertaining was one way that it would work. And we did a great deal of entertaining in the president's house, and we organized a number of interest groups which went out into the far reaches of the Boston community and integrated the newcomers into the faculty who lived in those locations, and that was lots of fun.
Now, are you talking about the matrons, Kay, or about you, about the president's wife organizing these, or was this a matron's activity at the time?
The president's wife was then the chairman of the matrons as opposed to the president. And I had done a lot of work, and so I simply carried that out with the president and the president of the matrons. And the reorganization turned out to be a very positive thing, and we had lots of good results from it.
What were the sorts of things you did?
Well, beside this introduction of the newcomers, we started the classes in English for the foreign speakers' wives. We started a program in which the faculty kind of adopted foreign students. That was a program that went on. And instead of being a kind of Tea Party organization, the women's group then became active in performing service, a service organization. So that was, to me, a very exciting part of it.
Mm-hmm. Were there a lot of women at that time who were involved? Was it easy to get people to participate? Because now, so frequently, one of the complaints is that it's so hard.
I know.
Do you want to talk a little?
Yes, of course, in that era, there were not many women or wives of faculty and staff who had jobs, and so it was a perfectly easy thing to call a meeting at 10 o'clock and expect a quorum, whereas you have now got to roll with the times, and evenings are the times that are scheduled that people can come. Mm-hmm. So volunteerism really flourished in those days.
Do you think it's a loss that, what if you compared those days to these days and the lives of your own daughters, for example, do you think there are some losses, or has it been gains? Or
I think that there are a lot of losses. I think that, and I'm thinking of the daughter who lives in Newberry. She works all day, very hard, professionally, and when gets home and does dinner for her family, there's not a great deal of time or energy to give to volunteer work. There's there's Saturdays and Sundays, but that's family time too. So I don't know how Cleo and the present chairman of the league really they have a harder time finding volunteer workers. That I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there were ways in which the MIT community was enriched by having women who weren't so dedicated to their own careers in those years?
I think that it made for a much more integrated faculty that knew each other and appreciated each other's talents. And a smaller but more enthusiastic group. Mm-hmm. I mean, as I look back over the
more
years.
Personal relationships, mm-hmm. and more informal
exactly.
opportunities for people to get together. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. And when Jay was president, did you feel that you were very involved in his career and the issues that were of great concern to him? Were there particular ways that you got involved in those?
I think that a great deal of Jay's work went on in Washington and in the academies and in affairs that I really had no part in. He would come home and we would discuss what was going on and the excitement of his work in the academies and in the science and in the engineering academies and in his work in establishing NOSHA and that kind of thing. And then I would bring him up to date on what was going on, not from his office point of view, but what was going on. I was his tech talk.
You told him what was going on. Well, do you want to talk a little bit about MIT was so involved, so central to so many of the issues that were going on at a national level? Do you want to, I think many people wouldn't know what NOSHA was. Do you want to talk a little bit about what some of those issues were?
NOSHA developed was the law of the sea. And he was appointed by Johnson to pull together a committee that would eventually write the law of the sea, and it became NOSHA, and is one of his accomplishments that has been spoken of a number of times. That period at MIT was a very well, it was quiet, but it was also very productive. I mean, the tensions were at the minimum, and everything was going forward. And as I recall, the only incident that I can recall was a rather funny one when we were in the president's house, and the tuition was raised from $800 to $1,700. And there were a large group of students who marched up in front and down of the president's house saying, $1,700 is too damn much. And we all stood at the windows and looked at each other and wondered if this was the beginning of a trend, which unfortunately
it proved to be.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. But do you, what about the whole issue of moving, 3 teenagers into that house? What kind of impact did it have on their lives and yours?
It had a great deal more impact on their life, I think, than mine. We lived in Belmont, which was a marvelous neighborhood that the kids could run up and down on their bicycles and skate, and all of their friends were within a few blocks, and there was absolutely no fear of anything. And we didn't have a TV, so fortunately the people across the street whose children were the same age did have TV. But when we came into the president's house, we did have a TV, and but the children missed very much their friends, and they stayed at Buckingham, which was where they all graduated from. And we had a student who drove them up and picked them up every day. But they missed their friends, and later on, when they weren't ashamed of the elegance of the president's house, they would bring in droves. And of course, all of their rooms were on the back of the president's house, which looks into senior house. So that turned out to be a source of great interest and excitement as time went on.
They get binoculars?
I don't know about the binoculars, but they certainly used their bicycles until there was a certain amount of tut-tutting, and so it was suggested that they use the sidewalks and not the lanes in the campus.
Uh-huh. You mentioned the elegance. Was that in their having to feel comfortable enough to have their friends come into this elegant house? Was the house elegant, and were your family quarters? Was that
It was elegant, and we used the entire house as a home. When Jay came home, we had drinks in the living room, and the living room served as a beautiful library. I found a whole lot of pictures of our first Christmas there, and it's really quite fun to see what we had, all the decorations and so forth. But it was it was family too. I mean, there were books around, and it wasn't used always ceremonially. We lived in that house.
Yeah, because when I think of my teenagers, it would have been a problem having a formal house with a bunch of teenagers.
Right. Well, I must say they didn't throw things around, but they felt perfectly at home. And Laurie had adopted pet raccoon, which she brought down to all of the cocktail parties. We tried to get them to serve hors d'oeuvre, but they weren't terribly good at that. But Laurie was very good with her raccoon, and that
became a conversation.
And the conversation, so that worked.
And what were you mentioned in the course of your talk? I know that you had so many very famous people who came into the house, and who were some of those? And
well, there were the early astronauts, and that was really a sensational afternoon. They came, and the faculty, a lot of the faculty were invited. And of course, the girls went around collecting all of the signatures and so forth. And that was lots of fun. And then we had, we had Morris Graves, and we had Fiedler, and we had CBS top reporters, and it was really a marvelously kind of international place that everyone felt rather comfortable in, and we shared it with the faculty and with students whenever we could. And it turned out to be a lovely, full life.
Well, you've described yourself prior to this as a rather shy person. Was it easy for you to be in the role of the hostess at those events?
Well, I tell you, I had done quite a lot of theater, so when I knew that there was a party, I said to myself, now you know what your role is, and go down and do it. And so finally, after playing a role, it became me.
Uh-huh. What had you done in the theater?
Oh, when I did a lot of I'm trying to think what the group was, but there were several groups, and I started out when the theater part was over on Boylston Street, and I worked with the as a total non-professional, simply because I adored theater. And then we did theater in the round in Walker. And
was this an MIT activity in some way?
Oh yes, all MIT.
I see.
And Bill Green was always the director, and that was fun.
Mm-hmm. And what did you do? What was your...
Oh, I just played whatever role they...
Oh, so you actually acted. I mean, you weren't just...
Oh,
yes.
yes.
Right. What, did you have a favorite part?
No, I did 2 or 3 Shakespeare things, which was fun. And I did them with Kay Bolt, who was a very close friend and very active in the matrons. And that was fun, and a number of the MIT professors.
Mm-hmm. Now, did the theater group have anything to do with the matrons? Was that a matrons?
Well, the matrons took the female roles, and the faculty men took the others. Mm-hmm. And during the radiation lab, we always put on a marvelous musical written by Kay Bolt, and Arthur Roberts did the music. Mm-hmm. So it was a very lively place.
Uh-huh. So there was really, it sounds like, a great deal more social interaction than one would imagine
absolutely.
These days.
Never a dull moment, just like there isn't now.
Uh-huh. But for other...
Yes, about the centennial.
Right. Okay. Okay. You tell us about that.
The centennial was perhaps the most exciting point in our life, and it came in 1961. And it was a 3-day, maybe 3.5-day symposium. And it started with the uses of atomic energy. And then we had representatives from all of the disciplines, arts and medicine and philosophy and, of course, science and technology. And it culminated in a marvelous dinner at the Statler Hilton. And it was the first banquet I'd ever had to design. And this was a real challenge. And fortunately, John Burchard was always looking over my shoulder. And but we designed a wonderful dinner, which started out with a lobster, and then spring lamb and wonderful little what are they called? The little things that are made of ferns. And it was the first time I'd ever used those, and so they were flown in from Canada. And then we had a lovely lunch, lovely salad, and then dessert. And then we went up into another section for coffee, and they involved steps going up, and we led on. And I had gotten a lovely brown taffeta dress with rather quite a long, not a train, but it was hung down in back. And as I was going up the stairs, and this was my first strapless gown, so I thought this was really something. And someone stepped on the back of my dress. And so
your train was derailed.
I recovered in time, both the dress and myself, and we went on to coffee. But that was what I remember most about that dinner party. The trauma
of your strapless.
of my strapless gown. But it all turned out very well, and that was really the beginning of the 20th Century Fund. And that ought to be mentioned because we were aiming for 66 million. And in the end, in 2.5 years, we made 88. And from that rose many, many of the new buildings around the campus. It was a very exciting time of building, and McCormick Hall went up then, and the Center for for engineering and life sciences, and it was and the boathouse. It was just a time of real excitement from an architectural point of view. And of course, with McCormick Hall, the number of women, which had been a very serious advocate for women and their place at MIT, as Leah Wiesner had, carried forward. And we only had 268 women when McCormick Hall was started. And now we have 40% of our students as women, which is a real triumph for MIT, I think.
Kay, you are very oriented to women, both, I think, for ideological reasons and maybe for personal reasons, from having grown up with a lot of women. How many were there in your?
Well, I had 3 sisters, all of whom were supposed to be boys, and 3 daughters. So
whether you wanted to or not, you had to pursue. Right.
Right.
Women's issues. Now, did your children ever think about participating in schooling at MIT, your daughters?
No, alas, they inherited my genes. And our eldest went to Stanford and took political science. And our middle child went to Radcliffe, and our youngest went to Vassar. And they are all professional women, but none of them took science and engineering or technology.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you look at your daughters, do you think you might have enjoyed having their experiences rather than yours if you had your life to live over?
No, I think that I've had just as interesting life, and possibly more so than they have. I think that if you are a professional, our eldest is a professional planner for for youth employment in London, and our youngest works for the brother-in-law of the King of Saudi Arabia, and she's a kind of controller of finances, which wouldn't interest me at all. And Carrie is very involved in technical and computer work with her husband. And I've just gotten my first word processor, and I look at the book and it frightens the wits out of me. So
you have to get an MIT freshman.
I know, or even my grandchild could tune me in, I think.
Do you think that Jay regarded you as participating in his career, or so much of it was in Washington that wasn't?
I think that it was really a partnership in which I was doing my thing here, and he was doing his thing here and there, and that our communication put together a total kind of scene. Mm-hmm. And we did have done a great deal of traveling together. And even then, he had the things that he was to do, which were usually had to do with government and education. And I would do the arts and the health situation, and that is how roughly we divided.
Could you tell me about one or two of your trips, and specific trips, and what they were all about?
The trips here involved going out and meeting all the alumni, and that was very exciting because I saw a lot of that. And we also went to South America and Mexico and so forth. And in Europe we saw alumni also, and that was I always got involved in the alumni wives, so that was exciting, and I saw a great deal more of the country than he did. But then when we left MIT, we went to the Ford Foundation, and in those 5 years, we traveled all over the world, because the foundation at that time had projects all over the world, and that was terribly exciting.
Was your role in relation to Jay at the Ford Foundation similar to what it had been when he was president of MIT?
Very much so. It was the first time that, in a way, I'd been off duty and had a chance to really develop what I was interested in. And at that time, I joined the Bank Street College Board and did their art and education program. And then I joined the National Board of the YWCA, and I headed an art project for Mayor Lindsay. And it was all very exciting, very new, and again, an exciting learning situation.
Was that connected? You mentioned that at MIT, this major architectural program had developed while Jay was still in the president's office.
Right.
Was that what really started you on getting involved with the arts? And
actually, what started me in getting involved in the arts was when we moved into the president's house, and those vast walls had
looking around.
Absolutely nothing on them. And I thought, well, the thing to do is to get art in here, and the best way of doing it was to borrow it. And I had the help of a marvelous committee on the arts. And
MIT people?
MIT people, MIT alumni, some from New York, a lot of gallery connections. And so we filled up the walls quite quickly, all on loan, except a few things. And from that, we branched out and started an art project for students, in which every Christmas we filled the gallery, which was then next door here, with all kinds of prints. Usually,
Building 14, right in Building 14.
yeah, usually under $100, but very good prints and posters and small sculptures, and they would come in droves and buy them, and we did that for 2 or 3 years. And then when we left, the art committee went on in a very quiet way, though nothing much happened. But when Jerry became president, he saw the possibility and pulled together the Council for the Arts, of which is now going for 23 years. And that has really changed the whole atmosphere, I think, of MIT.
Did you remain involved in that when you were at the Ford
I'm
Foundation?
afraid so. I still chair the annual meeting committee, and I have the fun of sitting on the executive committee and working very closely with the council.
Do you want to talk about some of the art on the campus and
Well,
what the
I
involvement of the council has been in that?
I think Jerry and
Jerry Wiesner.
Jerry Wiesner, and also dear, I can't think what his first name is. Johnson. Howard Johnson had gotten the feeling that this was a great improvement to the campus, and because we had so many buildings, Howard went to work and really developed the whole the whole plan of architecture, which decorated these rather stark buildings. And if you look around, there's hardly a view that doesn't have beautiful trees and flowers and bushes. And Howard was the one who really went ahead on that. Under Jerry, we started the whole sculpture, and MIT has the second largest sculpture collection on the West Coast,
Oh,
on the
really?
East Coast. It's a very, very distinguished one. And then, of course, the gallery is our gallery, which is now in the Wiesner Building, is world-renowned. I think it is almost a secret at MIT, but in the Boston community and in the national community and international, we are extremely well known.
How do you explain its lack of popularity within the MIT environment?
I think there's a slight weakness in communication, and I think that a lot more has to be done to develop more communication and more interest in the students and in the faculty. Ellen Harris has done an absolutely superb job in her 5 years as Associate Provost for the Arts. I mean, she has turned the Institute around, but we still have a long way to go.
Well, to what extent is the MIT Art Gallery related to the educational activities at MIT?
It isn't very much. That's what we need to work on. One of the committees of the council is the grants committee, and that has been the most successful, I think, of all the committees, which we give away $75,000 in seed money to students and staff and faculty for projects. And the seed money is given so that, with instruction on how to raise more money by themselves, they have produced a tremendous. We've given out over $1 million in the last 10 years.
And what sorts of things have come out of that there?
Well, one of the projects last year was the young painter, and a Chinese painter, and I can't think what his name is, who came to the council and asked for $300 to do some paintings of around MIT. And we looked at the sample of his work and we said, $300 isn't going to get you anywhere. Here's $5. Go out and do another. And he came back with another, and they were so superb that we said, we are now.
He was a student?
He's a graduate student in architecture. A young Chinese doctor who escaped and came over and is a painter. And we said, go back and do 12 more and we'll buy the whole thing. And we did. And they have now appeared on postcards. They're absolutely gorgeous paintings, watercolors. And so that's one example of being a little proactive in doing grants.
But you're saying there isn't an intimate relationship between the gallery and any educational part of the institute.
Right.
Will that come about, do you think, or is there something
I think so.
about
We're working very hard on it.
Or is there something in the two-culture problem that everyone?
I don't think so, because Ellen, who is head of the Office for the Arts, has in her council heads from all of the departments, so that she's working from the top down, and we're trying to work from the bottom up, and surely we'll meet.
Now, in the course of all of this, have you met some of the artists who have made some of the sculptures and the major pieces on this campus?
Yes, there, of course, every time they change a show, there's an opening. I try to avoid openings because you have to bounce up and down and not really see what's going on. And there are talks by the gallery director, Katie Klein, who is absolutely first rate. And so that's the
She
time.
recently did a wonderful tour for the matrons.
I know.
For the
she's an extraordinary
Women's
person.
League, I should say. Yes.
Right.
And what about some of the sculptors who have done some of the large pieces on the campus, like the Big Sail, for example?
Well, the Big Sail I know pretty well, because Margaret and Jean McDermott, who wanted to give a great gift to Cecil Green. Cecil Green and Eugene McDermott were partners in Texas Instruments. And when Cecil gave the Earth Science Building, the McDermotts wanted to do something very special. And they gave the court. And the weekend that Margaret and Eugene and Ida Rubin and Jerry Rubin all came up to our farm in Vermont, it was a lovely fall weekend. And they were discussing with Jay and with the rest of us, sitting out on the terrace with drinks, what would be exciting. And we came up with the idea of a sculpture. And then the question was who to do it and what scale and so forth. And so we went through a couple of sculptors who did their maquettes, and then we...
You actually commissioned maquettes to be...
Well, we went to their galleries and we looked at the maquettes, and we brought the maquettes up and to have various people look at them. And then we decided that Calder would really be marvelous. And so we were, Ida and I were asked to go down to Roxbury, Connecticut, where Calder had his house and a huge barn. He spent half of his time in Paris and half of his time in Roxbury, Connecticut. And so he came in, and this huge barn was covered with all of the working models of his sculptures. And we went up and down the aisles and up and down the aisles. And then Ida and I looked around and thought about this space and said, wouldn't that be marvelous? And Sandy came and said, you like it? And you know, Sandy always wore his red shirt, Sandy Calder. Always wore his red shirt, and he had a bush of white hair.
Who was he? I don't know who he...
Sandy Calder is the...
oh, Calder. I'm
yeah,
sorry. I'm
right.
sorry. Yes.
And so...
I didn't know the Sandy.
Right.
Yeah, part of it.
And so we said, how do you think it would look? And he said, I think it's got great possibilities. And so we went home and brought the news back, and he said, and Margaret McDermott is a great art collector and has a gorgeous collection in her house.
In Texas?
In Texas. And she liked the idea. So Sandy sent up a maquette. And the maquette was different from this one. And we said it looks a little skinny. It ought to have a little bit more width. And so he went back and did another maquette. And it was just what we wanted. And so then he went back to France, and he worked with a steel manufacturer who also worked in the shipyards. And so he drew the model for it, and that was approved, and then he went to work on the big pieces.
How long did this take? What was the gestation
It took a year.
period?
Took a year. And but it was very exciting when he brought it over and put it all together there on the campus. And then it was dedicated in '66 by the McDermotts. And that was a very exciting moment.
Were you involved at all with the Louise Nevelson sculpture?
No, I wasn't. I've been very fond of her work, but I would never have chosen that. I thought it was very spiky and not typical of her work, and I didn't like it. I don't like it.
That's an affirmative statement. And could you talk a little bit about some of the other things that you like particularly on the campus in the way of art?
Well,
and aesthetics?
I think that most of the pieces after we left were chosen by the Johnsons. He became the chairman of the board of the MFA, the Museum of Fine Arts, and has a marvelous taste for sculpture. And so he went to work and did, and it was through him that the sculpture really developed. Jerry Wiesner was influential in getting a number of sculptures in the Wiesner plot there out in front of the plaza. The first sculpture that the Arts Committee commissioned was that little one outside the library.
The Hadzi.
And the Hadzi. And we were terribly pleased with ourselves. And John Burchard was very supportive in this early art committee. And he said, you know, we have a little money that has been put aside, and I think we could afford something that
When you say we, is this MIT?
The MIT Art Committee, and I think that we could afford something. And he said, you look around and see what you like. And well, for $20,000, there wasn't a great deal that you saw and could like, but Hadzi was doing a whole series. And he came to MIT and he liked what he saw, and he said he would do that for us. And if you look at it now, the scale is much too small. And so we've been agitating to have it move someplace in something a little bit more exciting.
Put in there something
put there
larger.
in its place.
Right. Could you talk a little bit about the Greens and some of the people who have been such great MIT benefactors in the time you have been here?
Well, Cecil and Jay were both the class of 23 and have been very close friends. And Cecil comes back once or twice a year, and he and Ida, his wife, were marvelous partners in philanthropy. And she was very much interested in education and in women, and did a great deal for setting up scholarships and fellowships. And he has been just enormously interested and generous in everything. They've given millions and millions, and so have the McDermotts in all of their scholars from the Southwest. And Margaret came east this year to meet with her scholars.
Now, could you talk about that, the McDermott scholars? What are...
Well, the McDermott scholars were set up for people who had not the advantages. They're very often Mexican Americans and very often Indians.
This is exclusively an MIT program?
Yes, yeah. Well, at least the one I'm talking about is. And they now have well over 100, and they're very, very bright people. And very often they're brought here at the beginning of the summer so that they have an intense kind of orientation of planning. And
these are undergraduates?
Undergraduates, yes. All of them are undergraduates. And they have done very well. And I was sitting next to one this fall when Margaret came up and gave a luncheon for all of them. And this girl is a senior and is going into medicine, and was so excited about it. And she said, they've done such marvelous work here. I'm in biology and in that field, but I'm going back to medical school, and I'm going back to that region because I feel that's where the need is. But if you could see the stars in her eyes, that's what is so exciting to Margaret.
Well, Kay, this brings me to your own interest in activities related to serving people and the development of richer lives. And I know you've been very involved in issues of the aged, and maybe some things that you have done since in subsequent years, long after your president's wife role.
Well, when I got to be about 74, 3 or 4, there were so many decisions to be made. Where should we go into a life care community? Should we stay at MIT? Should we move into a house? Should we stay across the street from the infirmary, which was always a great advantage? And so I thought, well, if I'm having these problems, maybe the rest of my age group is having the same. And so we started out with doing 2 seminars a year on the problems of aging and aging successfully, so that we started out with housing, because that was selfishly my interest. And then we started out on all the medical problems that one faces, and what the proportion is of our aging group who has these problems, so that they are universal enough so that they would attract enough attention. And then what are the problems, and what are the solutions, and what is the cutting edge that's going on in solving these medical problems. And we do 2 a year, and they've been very successful so far. We've handled things like the brain, we've handled nutrition, we've handled the breaking of limbs, and home care, and artificial limbs, and we've always drawn on top people in both MIT and in the whole medical community, Harvard and BU.
And
medical.
These have been under the sponsorship of the League?
Of the League and the medical department.
So they've been a boon to the entire
Yes,
MIT
yes.
community. Have you had good participation at these?
I think so. It has built up every year. And I'm about to, Cleo and I are about to meet with
Cleo Schimmel, who was the past president
who is the past
of the
president,
League,
and who has been so enormously supportive in all of the programs, to decide what we should offer for this spring.
Do you want to talk about the celebration of your 80th birthday? I was thinking about that, and thinking that I have the feeling that there are 2 times in life when women are candid about their birthdays, when they're 20 and when they're 80.
Well, I was lucky enough to have my 80th birthday coincide with the 80th birthday of the Women's League. And Cleo Schimmel, who is the most creative character I know, thought it would be fun to have a birthday party. And it was indeed the most elegant birthday party and the most fun that I've ever had. My kids flew in and did a real roasting.
Can you share some of the candor?
They were so naughty. They told all of my weaknesses.
Now,
Well,
to wit.
to wit that I taught them mathematics by playing blackjack. That we had always a contest in the summer when the watermelons were ripe as to who could win the spitting contest. They brought up the fact that I love to hunt and skin and eat animals, and they dwelt on that too long. Well, I don't know how I'm ever going to live it down.
And do you want to talk a little bit about your birthday present?
My birthday present was the most exciting thing. It was the fact that we could now, in my name, put together 2 seminars in the fall on critical issues and envelop in that the aging successfully. So we will have 4 seminars and or lectures a year. And I had no idea of this. And it absolutely took my breath away. It has been a very exciting time. And I also got a briefcase to carry all of my bits and pieces around, and a gorgeous, gorgeous bag to take me traveling.